The topic of this video is defining learning objects. Despite the topic of the video, the purpose isn't to give a single definition that should be memorized, but rather to allow us to begin exploring some of the definitions and characteristics of learning objects. Here are some analysis questions for this video. What do you understand a learning object to be, and how have you already used learning objects, either in your education or professional roles? If you're having a difficult time narrowing down a specific definition of a learning object, you're probably not alone. There are many definitions of the term in the literature which vary considerably in detail. So for example, in online education using learning objects, McGreal categorizes the range of definitions of learning objects from very broad to more specific terms, citing specific definitions within each of these following 5 areas. Anything and everything, anything digital, whether it has an educational purpose or not, anything that has an educational purpose, only digital objects that have a formal educational purpose, to only digital objects that are marked in a specific way for educational purposes. We can take a look at a few different definitions which vary in their level of specificity. In the instructional use of learning objects, Wiley comments on the broad nature of the Learning Technology Standards Committee, that's a working group of the IEEE, or Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, definition of learning objects. This is a long definition, so you may want to pause the video and read it yourself. Otherwise, I'll read it out loud. Any entity, digital or non-digital, which can be used, reused, or referenced during technology-supported learning. Examples of technology-supported learning include computer-based training systems, interactive learning environments, intelligent computer-aided instruction systems, distance learning systems, and collaborative learning environments. Examples of learning objects include multimedia content, instructional content, learning objectives, instructional software and software tools, and persons, organizations, or events referenced during technology-supported learning. As Wiley put it, this definition, quote, fails to exclude any person, place, thing, or idea that has existed at any time in the history of the universe, since any of these could be referenced during technology-supported learning. Wiley offered a simpler definition of a learning object as any digital resource that can be reused to support learning, and is also deliberate in explaining that this definition rejects non-digital resources and also rejects non-reusable resources. So in other words, he believes they must be digital and they must be reusable. Taking the definition of a learning object in another direction, Kay and Canuck, in their article Assessing Learning Quality and Engagement in Learning Objects, the Learning Object Evaluation Scale for Students, offer this definition. Learning objects are interactive, web-based tools that support the learning of specific concepts by enhancing, amplifying, and/or guiding the cognitive processes of learners. There are also a few different terms that are sometimes used interchangeably in this context. So for example, in an article by Kay, Canuck, and Petrarca in the Interdisciplinary Journal of E-Learning and Learning Objects, they clarify that web-based learning tools are also referred to as learning objects. Educational object is another term that may be used in a similar way. Are there other terms that come to mind for you that may be synonymous with learning object? There are a few details or issues surrounding the intended use or possibilities enabled by learning objects that may also be worth exploring. Wiley names combination and granularity as 2 key issues that come up in discussions around learning objects. Metadata, as Wiley explains it, is relevant to the topic of combination. And in instructional design terms, as he also explains, this is also referred to as sequencing of learning. Ultimately, the idea was that metadata, which we could also describe as information about each learning object that could be used to tag or label those learning objects, could be used to allow computers to automatically and dynamically compose personalized lessons for an individual learner. A problem that Wiley referenced is that no instructional design information was identified by the Learning Objects Metadata Working Group that was defining standards for learning object metadata, and that was taking place in the early 2000s. The second issue, granularity, is related to the potential for learning objects to be reusable. Wiley explained that a key question facing designers would be, how big should a learning object be? So if we're thinking about metadata and that information that's being used to tag or label learning objects, the scope of the learning object, another instructional design term that Wiley referenced, needs to be identified. And again, this is to aid in other people or perhaps computers identifying where the learning objects may be used. Additionally, Wiley listed a number of characteristics of learning objects which can be used to further define them. So again, you may want to pause the video to read this list in full. To provide a little bit of clarity on some of these terms, extra object dependence refers to whether the learning object needs information about other learning objects other than itself, and this could include location on a network. Type of logic contained in the object refers to the function of algorithms or procedures within that learning object. Potential for intercontextual reuse, as Wiley explained it, refers to different learning contexts in which the same learning object can be used across different content areas or domains. Whereas the potential for intra-contextual reuse refers to the number of times that the learning object might be reused within the exact same content area or domain. So again, there are a number of different ways that learning objects can be categorized. Wiley provides a taxonomy of 5 different types of learning objects as follows. I'll quickly go through this list, providing examples that have been provided by Wiley, keeping in mind that you may also consider other ways that learning objects can be defined or categorized. Fundamental refers to an individual resource that isn't combined with others. The example that's given is a JPEG image. Combined closed describes a small number of digital resources that have been combined together by the object's creator, and the individual elements of that learning object are not likely available on their own for reuse. The example that's provided is a video. Combined open is when more digital resources are combined by a computer and individual elements of the learning object are available for reuse. A web page is given as the example. Generative presentation learning objects describe those that combine fundamental and combined closed types. So again, JPEG image or video as examples. These learning objects are generally to exhibit or display information. If they're being used for practice or assessment purposes, they require the ability to send messages to other learning objects that have that type of logic. Generative instructional learning objects combine a range of other learning object types, such as the fundamental, combined closed, and even generative presentation types. And they have the ability to evaluate learner interactions, again, as Wiley describes this, within those combinations. They may be developed to emulate what Wiley refers to as abstract instructional strategies. Doing a search of taxonomy of learning objects, you're likely to find a number of other ways of categorizing learning objects by different types of criteria. For more on the theory that guides this discussion, you might read the resource by Wiley, referenced a number of times in this video and noted on this slide. Additionally, and not included in our reading list, is the ebook noted here by Rory McGreal. It provides a great deal of information on the definitions, roles, uses, and design of learning objects. Lastly, here are a few synthesis questions to consider as we end this video. How would you define a learning object by today's standards? How might you categorize different types of learning objects? What roles do you see learning objects playing in supporting adult learning in your current work or education contexts? What do you believe to be some of the important elements of useful or effective learning objects?